What's going on, guys? It's Bromley. Today I want to talk to you about density. Density is a rarely talked about variable in strength training that, if understood and utilized properly, can be a big asset to your current training program. So to start off, what is density? Most of you may not have heard it because it hasn't quite come into the fold as a popular training tool. In the past, it's been written about, it's popped up in textbooks, there have been programs that have tried to exploit density as some type of new training gimmick. But as it stands right now, the term doesn't get thrown around that often. So density is just the amount of work you're doing per unit of time. So I'm going to get into the top 5 methods of the most effective and most commonly used ways to apply density to your current training program. So before I get into this, I want to talk about individual training variables because they all fit together in a specific way, and increasing one might actually decrease another one. If we're trying to focus on density, that means there's going to be a trade-off, typically with volume, which is the total amount of work you can do in a workout, intensity, which is the percentage, how heavy the workout is, fatigue, which is when effort is applied to a higher rep range, or strain, which is when effort is applied to a lower rep range. If we're going to focus on density, we're going to see a difference in these metrics. So I'm going to point out how each method affects those variables and when that's going to be better warranted. So the first method we're going to look at is shortening rest periods. That's the easiest, it's the most straightforward, it's probably going to benefit the greatest number of people, even though every other method we're going to talk about takes into account time in one way or another. A lot of them are just different ways of kind of tricking you into doing more work in less time. But just by simply shortening the rest period, you can bypass a lot of the trickery and add an immediate benefit to your current training program. So for those of you that think that in order to optimize your training, you need to go home, take a nap, wake up, eat a bag of Sour Patch Kids, go back to the gym, take the tour, talk to your friends, and then get into your second set, you are missing out on a lot of potential development by perpetuating your laziness. Now, I get it. You're always stronger when you take longer rest periods, but you don't actually need that level of recovery until you're right up against a competitive appearance, say in the last 4 or 5 weeks of a training cycle before you go into a meet. The rest of your training program, you actually need to accrue some fatigue. It's actually okay to not be 100% on each set because that is what's going to cause an adaptive cycle that makes you better than when you started. And part of the process of increasing stress and adapting is taking density into account. So for those of you that take those long rest periods, shorten them down, put the clock on, don't take longer than 3 minutes. The only exceptions would be after a really hard set, RP 9 or 10, especially if it's in a higher rep range. Yes, you need those longer rest periods, but for run-of-the-mill RPs, 6, 7, 8, you don't need those long rest periods. You can set the clock at 3 minutes. You can even adapt to the point where you cut it down to 2 and are still in a strength specific range. It's just a matter of not being a fat shit. I know it's really fun being a fat shit. I was a fat shit for a long time. It was hard for me to work out of it, but I was better for it. I recommend you do the same. Now, there are some programs that actually utilize decreasing rest periods in order to drive density up and drive the training stress. The one that stands out is a program called Boring. I almost called it Boring But Big because it's BBB. It's Big Beyond Belief. Thanks, Wendler. Big Beyond Belief is a program from the 90s that attempted to take weightlifting principles from the previous decades and apply it to bodybuilding. You thought it was nutty enough that we took Soviet data and just plastered it on powerlifting and called it good. These guys tried to take the Bulgarian methodologies and apply it to bodybuilding. So the program works up to 6 days per week, training multiple times per day, very high frequency. And it uses a couple methods in addition to that that you might see as being familiar. So this is the simple one. This is ramp 1. It's kind of the simple introductory ramp. So each week ramps up. Again, I use the 3-week waves. It's kind of a similar paradigm where each week gets harder before you reset. So ramp 1 starts you at 3 working sets across all these exercises. And again, you see relatively high frequency. Rest periods are fixed at 2 minutes here. And there's an undulating periodization approach. So each day changes the range from 13 to 15, 10 to 12, 8 to 10. So you're working across different thresholds, but the rest periods are fixed at 2 minutes. Well, as you get into ramp 1, week 2, you go to 4 exercises up from 3. Does that look familiar? And the next one, you go up to 5 exercises. Same rep ranges, I'm assuming similar loads, and the rest periods drop to 90 seconds. This actually gets more exaggerated in future cycles, starting at 3 minutes, getting down to 1 minute. You thought it was nuts when I told you to do increasing sets each week at 10 or 12 reps. This guy is telling you to do it as you cut rest periods down. So think about that for a minute. Now, I think that would be most effective if you are bodybuilding, if it's not performance-based, if you're not worried about meeting specified load metrics, because this is very unpredictable. If you're adding sets and increasing density by taking the rest periods down, you're not going to have good predictive ability for how it's going to turn out. I would recommend, if you were going to use actively cutting your rest periods as a way to drive stress up, keeping your volume fixed in the beginning and then progressing density first. Try to get a feel for how that goes, how quickly fatigue sets in, how much more difficult each set actually gets before you start doing this like multi-varied approach where you're changing multiple variables at once. I'm not a big fan of this right out of the gate, especially if you're in a strength specific range, as opposed to these really high rep ranges where there might be a little more play in the joints. And generally, I'm not a super big fan of this because most people aren't going to commit to using a stopwatch for every set of every workout, because you don't really have a margin for error. If you get distracted, if you forget to start time, if any of these things interrupts your ability to keep track of time, that's your progressive overload for the week. You have to really be on point. And I think it's a little impractical, and I think there's better ways to do it. So if generally you're giving up a lot by having these long rest periods, sure, bring them down. But in the context of this type of progression, not a huge fan. It can be done, but I'm not a huge fan. The second method is running an EMOM or clusters. Now, EMOM might sound familiar. It was CrossFit jargon for a long time. Every minute on the minute. Usually in the context of CrossFit, it was used for conditioning as these metabolic conditioning exercises. So you might have a couple of exercises, I don't know, a burpee and a kettlebell swing, do 5 reps of each one every minute on the minute for 15 or 20 minutes or something ungodly. And it's basically a way to kind of set an easy approach to interval training. Density is very high because effort is high with each one of those touches, because each round of work is not that high. It's the overall systemic amount of work that makes it difficult, along with this set interval of short rest, short work. Now, the cool thing about it is that it tricks you to do more work and to keep effort high, because it's in your best interest to not dick around in the early part of the set, because you want as much rest as you can get. And the rest periods you get are only as long as you allow yourself by actually getting through the work quickly. Now, EMOMs can absolutely be used for hypertrophy, for strength, for power, for capacity. You just have to set the percentages and the rep ranges appropriately. So a basic idea is that you're not going to go to failure on any of the early sets. You're going to be actually way, way far away from it. I generally like this for technique and power development on odd implements, things like strongman events, whether you're doing sandbag picks or dumbbell clean and presses, things that have a specific handle that are a little unconventional. This is a good opportunity to get meaningful work in while still working around this learning curve. So I like them for that. They can be used for standard barbell movements that are focused on size or strength. If you say start at 75%, do something like 8 or 10 triples on an EMOM, you are definitely going to find that in your compound barbell lifts, fatigue will pick up as you get closer to the end, and you can add weight linearly. There's actually a lot of ways to progress, and you're not going to be better for me going into all of them. But that's an easy one. Start at a preset set and rep range. Give yourself a lot of reps in reserve in the beginning, and let the short rest periods, let that rest interval allow fatigue to build up steadily over time. Clusters are another good one, and these are a little more accessible. These are a little more intuitive when it comes to barbell lifts, especially your accessory stuff. If you're a little gun shy about using these on your main lifts, you can jump right in by having your second or tertiary movements use a cluster set, and you'll be amazed at how well they work. A good example is, let's say, starting 75%. It's about a 10 rep max. Start out with 6 reps instead. Again, leaving a lot of reps in reserve. You're going to see that as a theme. The way you increase density is by making the work more sustainable instead of running straight up to this point of fatigue. So if you rest about 15 or 20 seconds, you could probably get 4 more reps. And if you rest another 20 or 25 seconds, you could probably get 4 more reps on top of that. What that amounts to is about 14 reps in a minute and a half or so, which is much, much higher than you're going to get at 75% for any standard set and rep scheme. Whether you're doing all out sets, whether you're doing reduced sets with low RPE, as long as you're taking several minutes in between each set, your density is getting lower and lower and lower. So we get higher fatigue, higher density. And if you take a few minutes in between each cluster set, you can actually get pretty comparable total volume. So it really is a boost to your total training stress. So I am a fan of clusters. All of this stuff generally, I think, goes better in the earlier parts of training. Cluster sets are going to be effective in like volume or accumulation phases, off-season phases where you're not so driven by strength-specific work. This actually looks similar, but it's a little different than rest pause. We're going to go to rest pause later. The key thing here is that effort is staying down so that you can have these short intervals that keeps density very high. The third method, lift for time instead of reps. Again, this is another trick. You're not just strictly keeping rest periods down. You are auto-regulating yourself in the moment by setting different training parameters. So instead of so many sets by so many reps with an established period of rest in between, now you're saying you have this total amount of time to work, do as many reps as you can, however you need, spread out that time. So you can look at that for an individual set, and this is something that strongmen do. It's one of the reasons I think that strongmen are the best deadlifters. Powerlifters are not better because they lift without a hitch. But I strongly believe a big reason for that is not just the way they approach deadlifting, but the fact that all strongman training taxes very heavily and in a very unique way the posterior chain. So everything we do loads the back, but specifically the way we do it. A lot of events have a time cap. So as we prepare for a meet, we're not just doing standard sets. We have a minute to get as many reps as we can, sometimes up to a minute and a half. And when we train our compound lifts that way, or even things like carries and loading events, we are engaging actively in density training, and we're exposing ourselves to a level of density that standard sets and reps just won't give us. So by training for density, it gives a very novel type of training stress that matches nicely in this back and forth with the standard sets and reps that strongmen also invariably will do throughout their training. Super squats is another example of this. It's one of the reasons why squatting is such a good exercise. You take a rep, stand up, take a few breaths, take another rep, and you do that for 20 reps with something around 70 or 75% of your squat max. That is immense density. Total volume is pretty high. Effort and fatigue is through the roof. So you're seeing a lot of different things increasing together all at once. And anytime you can get away with that, you're going to see a very, very nasty training stress that's going to be hard to match by anything else. So you can look at it within the minute, lifting for time within, minute and a half. The super squats runs, if you do it right, into like the 2.5 minute threshold, which is brutal. You can really only do that with squats. If you try that with something like deads or pressing, you're not going to have a good time. You can also look at the total workout. There's something called escalating density training, which I hate as a marketing term because all of these approaches escalate density. There's nothing special about this one. But it'll recommend, say, a 15 or 20 minute go around with 2 antagonist barbell movements. You do one, go to the other, and you bounce back and forth essentially as fast as you can throughout the entire time duration. Again, that sounds kind of CrossFit-y, and CrossFit does use those methods in their endurance metcons. But when it comes to strength training, applying that to antagonist barbell lifts keeps you moving, keeps density higher, and the fact that you're chasing total reps within a certain period of time, that's a stress that you're not going to get with standard sets and reps. All you have to do is progress linearly. I guess you could add weight in very slow increments. You could also keep the weight the same and just try to beat the total amount of reps that you got in that period of time. There's a lot of ways to approach that. It doesn't even really have to be a superset. The fourth method for incorporating density into your training take the sets out longer. Now, this is where we're going to switch it up a little bit because fatigue is going to be much higher. We're not keeping the reps down to allow you to sustain this for many sets. We're actually going right into the weeds. So this, instead of trying to match the volume that we're used to, this is purely high intensity style training. And we're going to see this with things like rest pause sets or other advanced fatigue techniques that bodybuilders typically use. So we're going to be seeing density really, really high in the short term for the individual set. Because we only have so many total sets that we could do, you're probably not going to match total volume, which is what makes it a high intensity approach. High intensity doesn't just mean high effort or the weight's heavy. It almost specifically means the volume is going to be lower. So for any of you who have stumbled across dog crap training, it's kind of infamous. I'm sure you've seen it pop up on the internet before. The meat and potatoes of dog crap training is doing a set to failure, taking so many breaths, usually adds up to 20 or 30 seconds of rest, going again, and then doing that one more time. So you have 3 mini sets with very short rest in between. Again, adding up to about 2 minutes of work, but with very high fatigue and very high reps. So for bodybuilding, that's great. And then what they do is they just progress it linearly. So you're getting the sets to failure, which is a nasty training stimulus. You're taking the sets past failure. So fatigue gets much higher than it ever could on a normal set and rep scheme. And you're doing that while progressing linearly. Obviously, that's going to lead to growth. I recommend this approach for accessory work. You can absolutely use it on compound lifts. Maybe not squatting. I would try it with lightened squat variations and lightened deadlift variations, front squats, RDLs, or maybe machine variations. But this is a great way to absolutely smoke the muscles involved with these big compound lifts and to get a lot of work in a short period of time. Density is super, super high here. The main difference between this and cluster sets is, again, we're going to failure. We're not pacing ourselves here. If you want high volume with high density, you really have to pace yourself. If you're doing high density in the context of a high intensity program, you can just go bananas. I mean, just go for it. Another example would be something like drop sets. Drop sets have very high density. You're doing a lot of work in a short period of time. And again, that's paired with very high fatigue. Here you're getting it, I would argue, more density because there's no rest associated with it. So you're going to failure at a given weight, dropping the weight, going again, dropping the weight, going again. I know you don't associate this with your favorite powerlifters, but there are plenty of people who have become the strongest men in the world who would routinely use stuff like this. If you look back through time, if you see the type of absolute bloodbaths that some of the best lifters in the world used to do as part of just routine training, it absolutely included stuff like this. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the deadlift sets that guys like Eddie Hall have done where, you know, he starts with a plate, does a rep as they add a plate each time, all the way up to like 8 plates, and then goes all the way back down. That's an example of high density. It has a twist, it's kind of gimmicky, but there is certainly a place for this type of stuff in the training regimens of even the best lifters, because it turns out that this is very effective for growing you, and it's also novel. It's different than what you're used to doing. And eventually, that's what you need. If you want to sustain growth, if you want to avoid diminished returns and stagnation, you have to be able to add in and then remove training variables in this ebb and flow. And when training gets stale, I'm telling you, put this into your accessory work, put this into some of your training variations, and you're going to see some new growth in a pretty short period of time, as long as you take it seriously. This stuff is not for the faint of heart. All right, the fifth and last method for increasing density in your training. Use supersets, giant sets, and circuits. Supersets are some of my favorite. We've already talked about them. The escalating density training utilized a superset. Superset is just doing 2 movements back to back. You do one, and then you go into the other. Now, if you use a similar movement or one that uses the same muscle groups, you're going to have a hard time. Fatigue will increase too much. I recommend doing this with antagonist groups. This allows you to get through your entire training sessions much, much faster. If you have an upper body day and you're doing your triceps, you're doing your lats, your delts, your biceps, pairing antagonist movements together keeps your heart rate elevated, keeps fatigue just a little bit higher systemically, and it allows you to cut through your workout in a much shorter period of time. And as you adapt to that fatigue, you're going to be able to build strength in the context of pretty short rest periods, and that's going to allow you to get so much more when you finally pull all that work out and allow true recovery as you go into your peak phase. So I'm a big fan of supersets. Giant sets work as well. Brian Alsruhe pushes them. Again, it's very efficient. Density stays very high. Add something to your training. And then there's circuits. When I think of circuits, I think of PHA training, which deserves its own video. That's an old-timey approach to cutting fat where you would just do, say, 5 compound exercises, run through your whole body, and you do everything in sequence in one big circuit. So even though the weights have to be reduced, you're still using a substantial amount of weight. You're doing it in the context of general fatigue, and density is very, very high. I could see an athlete using circuits to keep strength and power levels high in the context of the type of fatigue they're going to experience in game day scenarios. I could also see somebody using it in an off season to keep themselves moving while giving themselves a break from constantly increased loads. Anybody at any time can put all of their accessory into a circuit and run through it that way. Again, you're going to find a trade-off. Even if weight's a little bit lower, the huge surge in density is definitely going to make up for it. So these are very easy ways to increase the amount of work you do per unit of time. So that's density training, folks. These are 5 of the best and most commonly used methods. Leave questions in the comments. Better yet, take them to the Base Strength Forum on Facebook. Absolutely free. That's where I get a lot of inspiration for these topics. That's where I get feedback. That's where I interact with people the most. You can take it to Patreon or to the YouTube membership page if you want to support this channel. And those 2 groups always get priority. If you've used any of these tactics and had success, go ahead and let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.